A lot of 8-bit action platformers often have this expectation or reputation of being NES hard, brutal and punishing games that don't care about your feelings, or maybe they were just trying to keep kids from beating games in a single weekend rental. But sometimes, don't you just want to be a big robot dinosaur, stomping and punching your way through outer space without trying too hard? Well, if I got a game for you, it's DYNOWARZ, the destruction of Spondylus. DYNOWARZ was published by Bandai in 1990, one of a few interesting NES titles that saw exclusive releases in North America, along with Dick Tracy, The Rocketeer, Frankenstein, Monster Party, and a handful of others. Developing duties were handled by Advanced Communication Company, whose other works on the NES included ports of the East series, along with the infamous Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. With an easy target of dominating the untapped niche of robot dinosaur games on the NES in North America, DYNOWARZ with a Z would lay claim to the genre, while IPs like Zoids and even Dinobots from Transformers would be nowhere to be found. Japan did get a handful of Zoids RPGs and strategy games, and one Transformers run-and-gun game of dubious quality, but none of these ever came stateside. So if you're 9 years old and as obsessed with dinosaurs as I was, the DYNOWARZ cover art was like a tractor beam of radness. Special shout out to the extremely cool Nintendo Power poster too. So the game takes place in the Spondylus solar system, with you in control of Professor Proteus, a brilliant scientist and founder of the Robosaur project. But as each planet's central life support computer becomes infected with an unknown virus and becomes overrun with out-of-control Robosaurs, the professor realizes it's the doings of the deranged Dr. Brainius, a former colleague previously busted for conducting forbidden robotics experiments on humans, and he has returned to seek revenge using the professor's own Robosaurs against him. But enter the magnificent Cyborosaurus, Proteus's ultimate creation, which he must pilot himself to save the solar system. Now all of this juicy plot is only provided by the manual, by the way, with no mention of any sort of story or characters at all while you're in the game. The best you'll get in that department is a couple of repeated cutscenes between entering and exiting your robot dino buddy. Which actually brings us to how the levels are structured. There are 7 levels total, each split between man mode and dinosaur mode. The game kicks off with you in control of a little Professor Proteus armed with a spread shotgun and an impressively high jump, facing off with flying hounds of destruction in his lab, which of course has giant spikes everywhere, and eventually hopping into his trusty Cyborosaurus, at which point you can stomp around the planet's surface, fight your way through an onslaught of compromised Robosaurs and hazards, until reaching a boss and computer portal. Once the boss is beaten and the key obtained, you hop back out and enter the planet's artificial intelligence compound on foot, running and gunning your way to the infected core, blasting it to bits, and then traversing back through the compound once more until you're back in your dino and can teleport to the next planet on the list. The same routine repeats itself until the very end of the game. While on the surface, you might think there's some cool Blaster Master kind of thing going on here, where you can go in and out of your sweet vehicle, but unfortunately it's all scripted out in the way the stages are broken up, and you have no autonomy in that case. Both modes play fairly similarly as well, but with a few differences. Man mode areas are focused a bit more on platforming, with single screen rooms often full of moving or dropping platforms and a handful of enemies. You only have your spreadshot weapon, but it can be upgraded once with a power-up that will double your fire rate. You're pretty limited on the number of projectiles you can have on the screen at once, which can be a bit annoying sometimes, but also encourages more deliberately executed shooting as you aim for enemies or turrets. Your jumping requires some forethought as well, with a slight delay as you end up crouching briefly before a jump, and some of the platform cycles requiring surprisingly tight timing. And you'll also have to take into account some pretty strict collision boxes for properly landing on anything. Dinosaur mode is decidedly more clompy, with a heavier feeling jump and more focus on dino battling. Think Godzilla, but with less environmental destruction and cool atomic breath. You start with a basic punch attack, which is about as useful as you would expect from something modeled after a tiny-armed T-Rex. You could also pick up weapon power-ups including the Fireball, Laser Beam, Bomb Shot, and the bewilderingly weird Launch Fist, all of which can be upgraded twice. The power-ups don't disappear, by the way, So often you might even find yourself in a situation where a new power-up is a hazard on its own, as you lose your devastating level 3 fireball to an ill-placed fist drop. You also get a 1 use per level satellite defense weapon attack, which wipes the screen of enemies, but it can really only be used on the first section of these dinosaur stages. Enemies include a wide variety of robot dinosaurs of all species and sizes, from these tiny little hoppy babies that can still knock you to your doom, or all the way to the damaged sponge tricerabots. Little landmines and turrets also pepper the landscape you're stomping through, and while it can be a bit difficult to avoid occasional damage, luckily you have a very generous amount of health, along with sporadic items to refill your life or a barrier that will even stop any knockback from occurring. The mini-bosses are pretty generic, usually not much unlike anything else you fight in the stages anyway, and are generally no problem to deal with, assuming you have a bit of health left to tank them. I guess that brings me to one gripe about this game. A lot of it feels very recycled and repetitive at a point. You'll fight several of the same dinosaur mini-bosses multiple times with very little differences in their behaviors. The man mode compounds reuse the same assets and even some of the same room layouts, again with very generic enemies, and also the same behavior for the ending virus battles. Not to mention you have to backtrack through the same rooms without enemies just to leave the stage. The basic cutscenes, as nice as they look, are also reused often, music is reused, and yeah, I think you get the idea here. Despite that, something about this game just feels so damn cozy. I did play this quite a lot when I was a kid, so maybe it's nostalgia goggles to blame, but it's still nice to be able to take a casual, stompy stroll through this world, loaded with plenty of health, unlimited continues, and generous checkpoints, and just live your life as a plodding Cyborosaurus, fisting your way through the galaxy. It's a pretty easy and admittedly boring game, probably targeting a younger audience at the time, but oddly now very suitable for a worn down and tired old man like me. And a nice little afternoon romp if you're looking for a chill NES game to add to your gaming conquests. Now, of course, there are ways to make it harder on yourself, and recently I figured I'd learn the speedrun for this, and surprisingly uncovered a pretty intense run fraught with perilous moments and ridiculous amounts of lag and eaten inputs. Playing through the game normally and fighting everything in your path at a casual pace, you might not encounter this lag as much. But once enough objects are on the screen and the slowdown occurs, you'll often run into unresponsive controls. So the speedrun basically leads to finding a balance between managing lag, damage boosting as much as you safely can, routing out the item pickups accordingly to stay alive, and ultimately finishing the game deathless in order to keep your weapons powered up. It actually lends itself to pretty tense moments full of risk and reward, and has been a surprisingly challenging endeavor in my short amount of time learning the run. Now, I'm not gonna lie and call this game a masterpiece by any means, especially with the input-eating jank and recycled assets, but it's still something I come back to often, and can easily recommend playing through it sometime. I do really wish a sequel could have been made back then, something maybe with more variety of dinosaurs to play as, or just a bit more complexity in the level design or game mechanics. The concept was pretty rad for its time. They surely nailed the misleading cover art aspect, but it's probably safe to assume the devs here didn't have a whole lot of time to work with and just had to pump this one out fairly quickly. Squandered opportunity or not, I'd say it's still worth a stomp sometime. Thanks for watching, we'll catch you next time.